Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Ella and I'm delighted to be joined by John P. White, MVP, Tygraph Canada, who will be talking to you today about deep dive on Power BI and SharePoint. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. ESPC21 Online will take place on the 1st and 2nd of June. To be a part of this event, simply register today for free. Just last week, we announced our outstanding program, which includes one tutorial and one session by John White himself. His tutorial will provide a deep dive into Power BI. It's entitled A Grand Tour of Power BI, and his session will provide a guide to understanding Power BI. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com for the full program. After the webinar, we will have a question and answers session. Type any question you may have in the question window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation and throughout. The webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, which is John White. John White, how are you today?
I'm well. How about yourself?
Good now, good. Happy to have that intro over.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, thanks very much for it, and thanks everyone for attending today. It's nice to be able to speak to you, if virtually. I'm sure, like yourselves, are aching to get back to the more in-person events. It's obviously a much more dynamic back and forth, but we're gonna do the best we can today. I hope anyway. Today we're talking about essentially the integration between Power BI and SharePoint and the areas that they touch. I'm going to just get started by introducing myself if you're unfamiliar with me. My name's John White. I use the middle initial P because I don't exactly have the most uncommon name on the planet. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company. The company's actual name is Unlimited Viz, but we make a product called Tygraph. We're kind of known by that, so I use that here. And it's an analytical product. It basically analyzes usage patterns within Microsoft 365 for all of the different workloads. So if you're interested in that, let me know later, but that's going to be pretty much all about the product that we do. I'm an Office Apps and Services MVP as well as a data platform MVP. I've been Office Apps and Services or SharePoint for I think 11 years now, quite a long time, and the data platform, which basically means Power BI, for about 3 or 4 years now. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, but that's kind of why I focus on this particular area. That's my contact information up there on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after this. Anyway, if you just want to ping me. But I do want to iterate, if you have questions during this session, try to ask them in the chat window, and I will hopefully get interrupted, and I'll be able to answer those questions as we go. I don't like to lose anybody along the way. I'm going to also just make a brief plug for my podcast. I do a podcast with Jason Himmelstein every week. The podcast is called Bifocal, and we examine the Power BI world. So news of the day, once a month there's a new service release and desktop drop. We'll cover off all of the new features in that, and we have interesting guests on from time to time. So if you want to stay up to date with the news in the Power BI world, this is a decent way to do it. And but between all of us and me, that's how I keep up to date with this stuff. It kind of forces me to do it. All right, and today, and by the way, and before I launch right in, you'll notice at the bottom of most of these slides, there's a URL. There's also a QR code over on the bottom right. That's the same thing, it's the URL. If you want to go there, you'll be presented with a form, and it's asking you some basic demographic information. We're not doing a demo with that today. I usually use it for that, so there's some stuff we don't even need, but it's required. But if you want to fill that form out, you'll be sent a link to this actual deck. And there's also a question there. If you're more interested in tyGraph, which is the product we have, go ahead and say yes. Someone will probably get back to you. Otherwise, we won't do anything with that data. All right. So today we're going to cover off the basics of really what Power BI is all about, what SharePoint does with it. And then we're going to look at 3 specific areas of using Power BI with SharePoint. We're going to look at how SharePoint operates as a container, as a data source, and as a report canvas. And that's really most of it. Then we're just going to wrap up. So it's a fairly straightforward session today. And we should spend about probably half of our time in demo, I hope, as long as we have the time to get through it all. All right. So to start out with, what is Power BI really? And it has been, it initially started out exclusively as a self-service reporting and analytic tool. And over the years, it's also taken on enterprise analytics and reporting without sacrificing the self-service capabilities. So that's what it does. The idea of Power BI is you should be able to point to data where it lives, bring it in, be able to shape it to the way you need, mash it up with other data, and then get results. 5 minutes to wow was the mantra of the team when they initially built Power BI. In some cases, it takes a few more than 5 minutes, but you can start to get quick answers to questions in a big hurry. And actually, our first demo here should show you a little bit of that, depending on what your question is. So from a technical standpoint, what is Power BI? And I don't know if any of you here are as old as I am in the ecosystem, but if you remember Excel when it had Power Pivot and Power View and Power Query in it, and it still, by the way, has Power Query and Power Pivot for the most part, it allowed you to take data in and to analyze it. So if you took Excel and took those 3 pieces out of it that I was just mentioning and just got rid of worksheets, that's kind of what Power BI is all about. It's focused exclusively on analyzing the data, and it has these three major components. It has an ETL engine, and ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. It's a basic BI concept. That's the process of taking data from where it sits, transforming it into the shape you want and the way you want, and then loading that into some sort of an analytical type database. Also, it's known as Power Query. So if you're using Excel, that's referred to as Power Query. And then you have the modeling engine, and that's kind of the database in which the data ultimately lands. And then you can build out various dimensions and calculated measures to help you analyze that data, things like doing year-over-year analyses, et cetera, et cetera. In Excel, that same engine is called Power Pivot. And then it's got a reporting platform. It's a canvas that you can put visuals on. Again, back in the Excel world, that was the function that Power View performed. Excel itself performs that function within worksheets with pivot tables and pivot charts. The way you work with Power BI is through the browser, through through any old web browser from a consumption standpoint, and some light creation, and I'm going to show you that. We're increasingly moving toward a world where you'll be able to use the browser for creation, but today it's primarily used for consumption. And to build these Power BI models and reports, you're going to use Power BI Desktop. It has, like many Microsoft products, an unfortunate name. It should have been called, to my mind, Power BI Designer, because that's what its job is. Calling it Power BI Desktop tends to make people think this is the desktop version of Power BI, and it's not. It's the design client for Power BI. You're intended to consume these reports from the service itself. All right, so that's Power BI itself. When it comes to integrating Power BI with SharePoint, it's important to understand how Power BI sees SharePoint, because this integration can mean 3 different things. SharePoint to Power BI can be a container, and that is it basically has document libraries, and those document libraries can hold data files, CSV style files, Excel files. There are other formats as well. and you can point at SharePoint, the files within SharePoint libraries, just the same as you could point at files on a file system. So that's one role that SharePoint performs with respect to Power BI, and it's kind of unique in that role, in that because SharePoint is a cloud storage engine, it's very easy for Power BI to go and keep data fresh from it. And we'll talk more about that here in a bit.
Hey, John,
SharePoint.
can I just put in there, please? Sorry.
Sorry, what was that?
Can I just put in there? Just some people are saying the slides just look a little bit too big. If you could maybe zoom down one or two, it's just cutting off the end of the QR code and tie graph.
Oh, really? I wonder if I can. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. I'm gonna pick a different mode from GoToWebinar. Let's see if that works. All right, stop showing screen, and now I'm going to show my screen, and I'm going to pick monitor 3 with the taskbar. Does that make a difference?
Oh, it looks better on mine anyway. If someone wants to write into the chat there and see if it's the same. Definitely looks better on mine now. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to use that GoToWebinar's clean function, and I'm no longer going to use that. All right.
That's much better. Thank you. Sorry for
Great. No problem at all. No problem at all. No problem at all. So SharePoint itself also contains list data. It just SharePoint lists, and that is data to Power BI, not as a container, but in situ, in the list itself. So we want to be able to report on that data. And also the traditional role of SharePoint in the business intelligence space has been as a dashboarding service, a place to surface these reports. And it continues to provide that role as well. So we're going to look at these 3 different aspects of using Power BI with SharePoint. All right. Just have to regain focus there. All right. So let's dive into using SharePoint as a container to start with. All right. Now, this goes back to using Power BI, the service. That basically means within a browser. I can directly connect to content stored in SharePoint and start to build reports. Now, that content, it's very limited. And by the way, when I show this, don't think that this is all that Power BI can do. This is all that Power BI can build within a browser. But without having any client installed, you can connect to SharePoint and load data from CSV files and from XLSX files, not from XLS files. That's possible, but you need to use desktop for that. You're only going to be able to build reports, so the data already has to be in a nice structure. You can't do any of the extract, transform, and load capability, and you can't do any of the modeling. So as long as Power BI can make sense of the data in those files, you'll be able to build some reports. If that data changes, if those files are updated frequently, the reports themselves will be kept up to date automatically via an hourly refresh mechanism. And you can connect to any SharePoint library or to any OneDrive container, be it personal or OneDrive for business. Now, when you connect to an Excel file in particular, I need to bring this to your attention. When you connect to an Excel file, you can do it in one of 2 ways. On the left-hand side of this screen, you can import data into Power BI. So if you've got an Excel file and you have your data in worksheets, which you shouldn't do, by the way, but if it's a small amount of data and you may be using Excel as a medium to move data, you can connect to that, bring the data from the worksheet into a Power BI data set and report on that. So that's the import mode. Or you can work with Excel as it sits. You may have built up a very, very complex Excel report. It may be using Power Pivot. And if that's the case, you're going to want to connect to it as opposed to importing from it. And if you connect to it, the experience in Power BI is very much like the experience from within SharePoint when you open that file, because they both are just using Excel Online to render that report. The one big difference is if you're using Power BI to connect to it, is you can actually set up Power BI to keep that data refreshed. So Excel itself has a data source, that Excel file has a data source. As long as you're using the data model internally, which is again Power Pivot, Power BI will be able to, it may require a gateway, but it will be able to keep that data up to date on a scheduled basis. So how does that look? If you're going to use the service or use a browser to import from an Excel file, that file can be stored anywhere. So as a user, I would connect to Power BI. I'd say get data. I would then go out to one of these data sources, whether it's a file on my file system, whether it's OneDrive for Business, or SharePoint Online. I'd connect to it. The service then takes the data from the Excel file and builds out essentially a cube. And it's in the back end, it's really using Azure Analysis Services. It's not actually using that service, but it's exactly the same technology in the engine. And then to stay up to date on a periodic basis, and this is hourly, it will reload the data from that workbook into that data set, keeping it refreshed. So if you put a new version of the file there, you're going to get a new version of the report. There's one distinction to make here, however. If you're using a file on the file system, you're going to have to set up a Power BI or an on-premises data gateway to be able to refresh that file. And that's because the service obviously can't connect to your C drive. That's in essence, that's what's going on. So, but there is technology that'll let you do that. And I am going to suggest this is a bad idea. So you shouldn't really use that file system connector unless you absolutely have to. And if you're going to refresh, be prepared for a world of hurt, frankly. All right, so that second scenario where I connect to an Excel file is a little bit different. In this scenario, I've got an Excel file sitting in SharePoint, and it has to be sitting in SharePoint for this to work now, or OneDrive, but you can't use a local file system. I've got this Excel file sitting there, and it has a data set inside of it. We've used Power Pivot to build it out. In this case, Power BI, the user connects to Power BI, and Power BI uses Excel Online to render that file. That data set automatically gets moved over to Azure Analysis Services, essentially by Excel Online in behind the scenes, and then we can interact with it and perform calculations, etc. On a scheduled basis, this is what I was just talking about before, we can set up a refresh, and Power BI will connect to the data source for that data model within Excel and keep it up to date. The point to note here is that it's actually the model within the SharePoint file that's being kept up to date. So if your users are using SharePoint to access that Excel file, they get the benefit of that experience as well. They get to work with refreshed and up-to-date data. Okay, so that's the experience of connecting with the service itself. When you use Power BI Desktop, it's a whole different world. With Power BI Desktop, you can, of course, connect to CSV and XLSX, but you can connect to XLS as well, the old format, and many, many, many more file formats, JSON, Parquet, all kinds of different file formats that you can connect to. It lets you use Power Query to do data mashup and shaping. In this case, you build your report and then you publish the report to the service. You push it up to the service when you're ready. You're not working with the report in place. In this case, if you want your data kept up to date, you're going to have to go into the service and schedule it yourself. It's not a difficult job, but it's an action that does need to be done. It's not automatic. Just as with the service, if you're going to be working with local files on a file system, you're going to need an on-premises data gateway, and you're going to have appropriate access. The one thing I want to call out, and really the biggest message I think today that I'd like to relay is, if you're going to be working with file-based data, Excel, CSV, things like that, you don't want to be using the native connector like you see over there on the right-hand side. You see an Excel connector, a CSV connector, an XML connector. You want to use the SharePoint folder data source, and I'll show you why. But essentially, when you're working, if you work with the file-based connectors, Excel, et cetera, they assume that you're connected to a file system. So when Power BI Desktop loads from that file, pulls the data from the Excel file, it lets you build out that data set. You then publish that data set out into the Power BI service where users can consume it. Once it's in place, if I want to keep that data up to date, I can schedule the refresh and I go through that on-premises data gateway, but I have to have that on-premises data gateway set up, and I have to have that file defined as a relevant or an allowable data source to be able to do this. It's possible, not recommended. If you go ahead and use the SharePoint folder connector, and I'll show you how to do that here, you can connect to any of those data, those file-based data sources. But the beauty of it is they work the same way. You build out your report the same fashion from Excel. But now when you set up your refresh, you no longer need that on-premises data gateway. You're refreshing directly from SharePoint online in the cloud. Hopefully that's clear. I'm going to demonstrate these two scenarios now, hopefully. All right, you're looking at Power BI desktop there. That's for just a few moments from now. All right, so I have a file sitting here in SharePoint Online, this file here, 2018-0901 to 2018-0930. And what that file is it's literally the thermostat data from my house for the month of September of 2018. I have an Ecobee thermostat. It records the furnace runtime in 5-minute increments, along with the temperatures and some other data. And I'd like to draw a graph of that usage over that particular month. I'm going to go to Power BI to do that. So I'm going to move over here, and I'm going to go into Power BI. So you can go to app.powerbi.com up here. That's your entry point into the Power BI service. So I'm in the service now, and I'm just using a browser. I can see a bunch of data sets that I already have loaded in here, but I don't have this one loaded. So I'm going to come down here and click Get Data. And you see a bunch of options. I'm interested in files. I'm pulling data out of an Excel file in this particular case. So I'm going to click on Get. And you can see I have a number of options. These are the ones I outlined before. Local file, OneDrive for Business. I'm going to come back to this one. And then SharePoint team sites. If I pick OneDrive for Business, I'm going to go into my OneDrive for Business. I can get to my personal OneDrive from my personal workspace. You don't go to your personal OneDrive from, this is a group workspace right here. If I have data somewhere else in another SharePoint team site, I can access it by going here, entering the URL of my SharePoint team site, and accessing the files. But I can also tie a SharePoint workspace, in this case it's demos over here on the left. I can tie that to a particular SharePoint site within Power BI. I've done that, and it shows up, when you do that, it shows up like this. It calls it, for some inexplicable reason, a OneDrive. But what this is the document library for that workspace. So I'm going to click on that. And I have to navigate it, and it's in my Excel demos folder from that library. And you can see this is the file we were just looking at. And I'm going to click on that file and select Connect. And now I get that dialog box I was showing you before. Import data or connect to it. Well, I want to import this data into Power BI. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Import. And you can see up in the upper right-hand side, importing data. This could take a little while. I'm going to give it just a second. Okay, that data should have imported from the file. I'm going to click on the data set, and I get the brand new, this is brand new this month, data set page. And from here, I want to create a new report from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right in the service. Okay. And so you can see this is the basics of building a Power BI report canvas. And most of this is the same when we get into Power BI desktop, you'll note. So this is the canvas area right here. And over on the right-hand side, we have a couple of panes. We have the visualization pane and we have the fields pane. And the fields pane is showing us what our data model looks like. And this is essentially pulled all of the columns in from the Excel file. And that's what I want. So I want to plot my furnace runtime over the month. So I'm just going to click somewhere here on the canvas. And I'm going to start by selecting the measures I'd like to work with. I'm going to just move this over so I can read them a little bit better. I always have trouble with the mouse. I might not be moving this over. Okay, I'm not. I roughly know what they are anyway. So I've got, basically this furnace has two stages of cooling and 2 stages of heating. So I'm going to pick my cool stage 1, and I'm going to pick cool stage 2, and heat stage 1, and heat stage 2. All right, so I've now got a column chart. I'm just going to spread this out a little bit more. And now I want to see this plotted. This is for the entire month of September. I want to see how this plots out over time. So I'm just going to find my date field. I'm going to select it. And you can see it's automatically getting added to the axis field. So we've got four measures in our values field, and we've got the date is providing our x-axis for us. So that's kind of nice. And I'm going to just change this report a little bit. I'm going to just make it a little bit larger. I don't want to make this a side-by-side chart. I want to make it a stacked column chart. So that's looking pretty good. Now you can see right away I'm getting some answers from my data. That didn't take long. You can tell the month of September in 2018 was warm at the beginning of the month, so the air conditioning was on. This is the cooling. Then the next week it got cool and the heating came on, and then the next week it got warm again. It's like that where I live. And then at the end of the month it kind of got cool permanently for the rest of the winter. So I'd like to see how cool or how warm it got. And I've got a temperature value here. I think it's called outdoor temperature. There we go. So I've got outdoor temperature, but I'd like to plot that as a line, and that's a different visual. So it chose column chart for me by default when I started picking data. I changed it to stacked column chart, but there's another chart called the line and stacked column chart. It's a combo chart. And now that I have that, I get an extra field down here for line values, an extra area in my well. So I'm going to take my outdoor temperature and I'm just going to add that over here. And now you can see my temperature has been plotted. But there's something funny going on because you can see on my y-axis, which is giving my runtime numbers, the furnace, it's in seconds. So you can see if I hover over here, my cool stage 2 ran for 7,860 seconds. Stage 1 ran for 15,000 seconds. And if I hover over my outdoor temperature, you can see the average was 7,018 degrees Celsius. There's something wrong with that, obviously. So what's wrong? It's the nature of my data. As I mentioned before, the thermostat is recording the runtime in 5-minute increments. So for the previous 5 minutes, it tells you how many seconds it was running. So it makes sense to add those numbers together. That's the total runtime in these column charts. But when it reports temperature, it's reporting the temperature at that point in time. They're both numeric values, but we want to handle them differently. Temperature needs to be averaged, not summed. But the default behavior is sum. And I can't change that by using the browser in the service. I can't change that permanently. I can't say temperature needs to be an average. I can do is in this particular visual, I can come over here and say, for my line values, I don't want you to use the sum, I want you to use the average. And when I do that, you see we get a second axis over here, which is in temperature, is in degrees Celsius. And this is a little more reasonable. On this particular day, the average temperature was about 20 degrees. So we've gotten some answers out of our data already. And if I want to get a little more detail, I can. I could just say, I could pick a date and a time. I've got a time. Date time is separate. Okay. There we go. And I could say my cool stage 1, cool stage 2. And what I'm doing now is I'm building out a table. It doesn't really matter which order I do this in. And then the temperature, the outdoor temperature. Okay. So again, you can see when I add the numbers together on this table, I have to go and do that again for temperature on tables. Again, I'm going to go with average, but now I get a total average over that period of time. But although the individual numbers are correct, but just as with anything else, Power BI, I can select any one of these data points, and all of my visuals cross filter. So by selecting September 9th, I get the runtime for that particular day, and you can see this 5-minute increment, the furnace ran for 300 seconds, et cetera, et cetera. You get the general idea. If I go ahead and save this now, I'm gonna just do that. The buttons keep moving around on me these days. All right, ESPC webinar. I'm gonna call this report furnace sept. All right, and then I'm just gonna hit save. And that should save back to the service. I can go back to my demos area. I can go over to content, and I should be able to see there's ESPC webinar furnace sept. I can open that up at any time, or anybody who has access to this workspace can open it up and edit that. If I come into my data sets, that's my data set, the 2018-019. If I go into the schedule refresh section, you can see I only have this OneDrive refresh option, and it's either on or off. So you can either turn it on or it's off. If I should turn this one off, it's not going to change after the month of September. But if it was going to change, I'd turn it on, and then it would stay up to date. All right, that's one way of working with things. Now let's change that scenario a little bit. Down below, that's 1 month, but I actually have my Ecobee data for month over month. I've got it for about 2.5 years. And I think this report would be a lot more useful if I could aggregate that data together. How do I go about doing that? I'm basically going to do two things at once here for you, just in the interest of time. I'm running Power BI desktop here. It's a downloadable design client. And I'm going to go ahead and get data from another source. So my actual raw data comes in CSV format. It doesn't come in Excel format. And so if I wanted to go and get that data, I could pick the CSV file and I could go out and read data from any one of those files. But as I said before, these file-based connectors are a bad idea. We probably should use the SharePoint folder connector. And I'm going to go ahead and select that. And I'm just going to quickly go back here and grab the URL to my SharePoint site. I'm going to paste that in there. All right. It says SharePoint folder. That does not mean you need to put the URL of the folder in. It means it wants the site URL. You can see it in little letters down here. So I'm going to pick OK, and it gave me an issue, and I don't know why. There, okay, it's fine now for some reason. Might have been a trailing space. All right. Oh, I think it was the trailing slash, actually. So what it's doing is showing me all of the files that are in this site collection. That's what the SharePoint folder connector gives you. And I don't want the metadata for the files. I'm going to go into the transform data button, and that's going to open up Power Query. In my case, it's opening on a different screen, so I just have to let it open, and I'm going to drag it over here so you folks can see it. Oh, come on. It's not behaving for me. All right, I'm going to maximize it on this screen. I've got different resolutions happening. And I'm not used to doing this, but 1 second, sorry for the delay. All right, is it going to behave now? Let's hope so. All right, let's go back. There we go. All right. So it starts out with query 1. I'm just going to call it files. Doesn't really matter what I call it. And you can see these are all of the files that are in part of the site collection. Now I know that my files are in a folder called Ecobee, but I'm not sure where in the site collection that is. I can't see it right off the. I'm impatient. What I want to do is I'm just going to use a text filter on this column. So I pick the drop down on the column header. I'm going to say this. I know that my folder has the word Ecobee in it. So I'm going to put the word Ecobee in this contains box. And I'm going to click OK. And it should filter my records down to all of the files that have the word Ecobee somewhere in their folder name. And you can see, uh-oh, my table's empty. Did I screw that up? I did. But that's okay. I'm working with Power Query. Power Query builds a series of steps along the right-hand side. And I can go back and change those steps. So if I go back, I can see my source again. I come down to my filtered rows button. There's nothing, but I can change what I selected by clicking that little wheel button over on the right-hand side. And I know what the problem is. It's case sensitive. Power Query is case sensitive. So we're looking for an uppercase E in my folder name. And very quickly, we can see what's going on. There we go. So those are all of my files. Well, it's actually more than all of my files. There is a file, there's an Excel file in there that's going to give me grief if I don't deal with it somehow. So how do I get rid of it? Here's all my CSV files. Well, if I look, this is the extension column. I'm just going to pick my drop down. I say, I don't want to see Excel files. So I'm just going to deselect it from my options. And there we go. I'm going to pick OK. All right. So once I've done that, what I want is to get access to the contents of the file, not just the metadata of it, which is what you see here. Now, I could just click on binary, and that would be the same as opening up that one file. So if you did just want to do what I did before with the service, by the way, this is a better way to do it with desktop because it lets you use the SharePoint folder connector to get at it and make it refreshable, as I was mentioning before. But I want not only the data that's in that file, I want data in all of the files. And I'm going to use this combine button in the upper right-hand corner to do that. So I'm going to click combine, and Power Query is going to create some Power Query functions for me. Don't worry, you don't have to know how to build those things yourself. I can do that right here. But I can't do it right here. It's showing me what the file looks like, and you can see there's a bunch of header information in each one of these files, and that's going to screw me up, but I can't do anything about it right now. I'm going to click OK and see what happens. And it's going to load data basically from the first file it finds and show it to me to say, is this okay? And I can do transformations on this data, but it's going to be repeated for every file it loads down below at row 1000, whatever it is. What I want to do is come back up to my sample file and perform some transformations on it, because if I do that, those transformations will be repeated for every file that gets loaded in the combine operation. So I'm going to do a couple of things very quickly. I'm going to go up to this column. I'm going to remove top rows. I'm going to remove the first 5 top rows because that's how big my header is. And then the next thing I'm going to do is use the first row as headers. And then bang, the data is exactly the way I want to. So now I come down to files and I have an error. Oh, what's going on? You can see the column 1 of the table wasn't found. When I promoted that first row as a header, I changed the names of my columns, so anything that referred to them later on gets screwed up. So you can see in my resulting query, that's a problem. If I just go up one level, you can see my data is fine. In this case, all I was doing was changing the data types of the columns. I don't need that step, and I can get rid of it. I just click on X. Here we are. All right, so now I can do a couple of more transformations. I'm going to do them quickly. I don't need the name of the file it came from, so I'm going to remove that column. I'm going to change this to a date column. I'm clicking in the little little icon to the left of the column header. This is going to be time. Now I want to change a few columns at the same time, so I'm going to select them, and I have to come up here now to transform. I'm going to change the data type to text. And then the rest of my columns are going to be numbers. So I select them all. I'm going to change the data type. In this case, I'm just going to make them all decimal numbers, even though some of them are integers. And I'm good to go. So now I'm okay to go and build out a model. I'm going to go to Home, close and apply. And this should take just a moment to load. It should take a few seconds to load. And it'd be a good time to ask if there's any questions. But if there's not, we're just going to watch the data load into the model. And what desktop is doing now, it's going out to the SharePoint site, and it's iterating through all of those CSV files. So it won't take too long. I think we got about 250,000 rows at this point. It's 2.5 years worth of data in 5-minute increments. As time goes on, this demo gets slower. There we go. Okay, we're almost up to 300,000 rows. Okay, now you'll recognize, for the most part, this data set over here. It looks a lot like the one before, but there's a couple of important differences. For example, outdoor temperature, I can select this measure now, and I can come up here and I can say the default summarization for it is going to be average, all right? Or even better, I could right click on it and create a new measure, a new calculated measure, and I could call it average temp to be very clear about what I'm doing. That would equal average, and I'm going to say outdoor temperature. And this is DAX. It's the data analysis expression language. It looks an awful lot like Excel formula language. It's meant to. All right, so let's go and do the same thing I did before. I'm going to grab cool stage 1, cool stage 2, heat stage 1, and heat stage 2. I'm going to make that a stacked combination chart. I'm going to add my outdoor, not my outdoor temperature. I'm going to take my new measure and make that my line value. And you can see I've got my 2 axes the way I want them. I don't have the time axis yet. I've got date, and I'm going to drag date over to my shared axis. One thing is different. it's built out an automatic date hierarchy for me. I don't like to use quarter, but that's okay. So I could drill down into any one of those years into the months, or I could drill across the years to the months. And so just like that, I've got data from my thermostat across all of those months. I'm not going to take it any further than this from a report standpoint, just so you can see what that capability is. But it's fairly powerful indeed. And right off the bat, by the way, you can see that 2019 was a cool year here compared to both 2018 and 2020. If I want to publish that out to the service, I hit publish. I have to save this file. I'm just going to go ahead and hit thermo ESPC, just because I have to pick a name. You have to save it locally before you can publish it, and then I should get prompted for a workspace to publish it to. Come on, Power BI desktop, don't let me down. And it's going to take forever. All right, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip back to the slides now, because I am going a little bit long, but I felt that was that's an important part. So I'm gonna just pop back to the slides. By the way, when I would select a workspace, publish it, and that report would be available to me. That's really the only point I wanted to make there. All right, let's look at SharePoint as a data source. We work with Power Query when we work with SharePoint. Power Query, by the way, applies, I've mentioned it before, to both Excel and Power BI. You can do all of this stuff with Excel. You got different connectors that you can use to work with SharePoint data. We've already seen the SharePoint folder connector in action. We also have OData, because you can get at SharePoint list data as OData. But we also have the list and the online list. And that's what you use to work with list data. The only difference between the two is one's for on-premises and one's for SharePoint Online. I'll let you figure out which is which. But we build a cached data model within Power BI, which is good because we're not pounding away on the SharePoint list. SharePoint is not a very good storage mechanism for reporting if you want to be querying an awful lot. The same data set, by the way, is supported by analysis services, both flavors. And you can use Power Query to mash up your SharePoint data with other things. The important thing to know, though, is it's got helpers for complex SharePoint data types, and all of this stuff works with on-premises if you're using an on-prem data gateway. I'm gonna just skip over that bit. I do want to say a lot about complex SharePoint column types. If you've ever worked with SharePoint data as a developer, you know it's not as simple as it may look. A rich text field doesn't automatically have bolding, it uses HTML, and that's how the data is stored internally. Power BI doesn't support HTML. So how do we deal with that sort of data? Lookup fields get expressed as a number instead of a person's name, for example. A person is a type of lookup field. So there are various techniques to working with these complex data types. I'm going to show you one of them here in just a second. The important one, well, there are three really. There's the field values as text column. The field values as text column will give you the textual representation of the data, basically how that data looks within a SharePoint list. So that's your get out of jail free card when it comes to working with SharePoint list data. You get column extensions if it's a lookup column. So if you're dealing with, say, a person field, you can get not only the person's name, but you could get their office and their manager and their phone number, etc., through the use of one of these column extensions. And one of the really cool parts with Power Query and Power BI is it will let you build out relational tables from SharePoint, which has kind of been panacea for SharePoint for years and years and years. Details on working with these blogs are available. I've got several with these blogs. These field types are available on my blog. I've got several articles. Again, I don't expect you to write them down. You can get the slides by clicking on that QR code. But if you want to go into absolute details for each type, please feel free. But I want to get us straight to the demo here because I think that's far more instructive. There we go. It's finally pulled up my published workspace from before. I'm just going to cancel this and I'm going to create a new report. And file new. And before, I'll come back to it, but I want to come down here to a list that should be called properties. Why am I not saying? There it is, properties. And this is a SharePoint list that's it's a bit cumbersome. It's got one of every complex SharePoint data type, and the scenario here is it's property listings for real estate. And you can see it's got a picture field and a location field, and it's got a managed metadata field, and it's got a rich text field, etc. We're going to be working primarily with the amenities field, which is a multi-value column. It's kind of the hardest one to work with. And we're going to have a look at how you can work with that in Power BI desktop. So I'm going to go ahead here and get data from another source, or the get data button. It's the same thing. And I'm going to just, in the search button, I'm going to type in SharePoint. And I'm going to pick SharePoint Online List because that's what we're working with. All right, it wants to enter the URL. We want to be working with the 1.0 of the implementation. They've got a beta one out that is incomplete. You can't do all this stuff. So we're working with the 1.0 version of the connector. Just going to click OK. And what it's going to bring me to is a list of all the lists in my SharePoint site. And there's a lot of them, including things like the user information list, which has information that is backed in a person field, managed metadata, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm interested in properties. I'm going to select properties. You can see there's only 5 records here, but this is our data. This is our properties data. And let's go into transform data. All right. So we don't need a bunch of this data to start out with. So I'm just going to select these columns here. I'm going to get rid of them. The picture column is a record. I could get in there and pull that out. I don't need it right now. The location field I can get other ways. You can see it's a big bag of JSON data. I'm going to remove that column. The title I want, asking price, neighborhood ID is a number, and I want the neighborhood. That's a managed metadata field. I'm going to remove it. Description, rich text. See that div? That's HTML. We don't want that. Agent ID and agent ID string. Those are both person fields, and I don't want the number. I'm going to get rid of those. List date, more info and continent I don't need. Remove those. Sold, I'll keep. Amenities, you can see, is expressed. Each item is a list. We'll come back to that. Content type I don't need. Compliance asset ID I don't need. I'm going to remove those. The country or origin, city, all of that stuff is coming from the location field. It's good data. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to remove the geolocation that has latitude and longitude. And most of the rest of the data I don't need, with one notable exception. I'm going to scroll all the way over here and select them all. But I do want to point out author and editor, taxonomy catch-all, agent, etc. These are all those column helpers, and I could drill in there to get more information, like the person's phone number if it's the author, or the agent, or the neighborhood, right? That sort of thing. But I'm going to come back here quickly to field values as text. I'm going to deselect that column. I don't want to delete that. All right, but I've got the ones I want to get rid of. I'm going to remove them. Field values as text is important, and I'll show you why. I'm going to expand this out. So if I select field values as text, it's going to show me a list of columns, the same list of columns I was just looking at, but with one important distinction. I'm going to remove select all. And remember, I removed neighborhood, description, and agent because they were numbers and rich text, etc. I'm going to deselect use original column name as a prefix. Now, if I click OK, it's going to pull the data from them out as straight up text. And that is something I can report on. So I'm happy about that. All right. Now, I'm going to come back over here to amenities, and I've got a list. How do I work with lists? Well, I'm going to expand that, and I get 2 options. I can expand to new rows, or I can extract the values. I'm going to go ahead and extract the values for now. When I do that, it says you need a delimiter. I'm going to use a comma, and there you have it. There's all of my amenities for each property. So I'm quickly going to load this into my design surface. I got to get to this fairly quickly. I'm going to open up properties, and I'm going to create a quick measure. And it's going to be equal to the count of the rows in the tables, okay? And the table name is properties. All right. So now I have a measure. I can put it on my design surface, and I want to turn that into a card. All right, and then I want to have a table down here that has the street, the title. Oh, I don't want the street, that's geo. I want to build a table. All right, I'm going to start with the agent, and I'm going to try the asking price, and then I'm going to have the street. There we go. That is enough for now. And I also now want to have a slicer. This isn't the prettiest report in the world, I realize that. I want to have a slicer for amenities. And so I've selected up, and I'm going to select the slicer visualization type. And there you have it. So now I can select all the properties that have appliances, a garage, and a basement. There's 2 of those. All of the ones that have this, all of the ones that have this, etc. But it doesn't let me select all the items that have appliances. How do I deal with that? All right, I'm going to jump back into Power Query. And I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to get rid of the amenities column that's with the extracted the way I extracted it. So I'm going to drop that. I'm going to turn this very quickly into a whole number. Okay. I am now going to copy my query. I'm going to duplicate it. All right. I'm going to come back up to properties, and I'm going to get rid of the amenities column altogether. And I'm going to come down here to this one. I'm going to call it amenities. And I'm going to select ID and amenities. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to remove all of the other columns. So all I have is ID and amenities. Now when I expand this, I'm going to pick the other option, expand to new rows. Now I don't know if you know where I'm going with this, but I've got that original table, and now I've got this amenities table. I'm going to close and apply this. All right, you can see there's a problem with my visual because I've deleted that column. I'm going to go down into my relationship view. You can see I've got a model. In this particular case, I'm going to select my cross filter direction to be both. All right, so that means one item will filter the other. And then I'm going to open up amenities. Oops, I did not want to turn it into a pie chart. Okay, I'm going to open up amenities here. And I'm going to drag amenities and replace the other field with that. Now I have a slicer that I can select to see all of the properties that have appliances, all the properties that have a basement, all the properties that have a driveway. We can see I have 2, 1, et cetera, et cetera. It's working the way we want it to. I can hit publish that to the service, and that's just going to work. In the interest of time, I'm going to pop back to the slides now because I have a few more, and I'm already kind of past the point for questions. So bear with me. All right. So that's working with SharePoint list data. Working with SharePoint as a report canvas. You have a number of options. How do I surface that Power BI report in SharePoint? You can use the SharePoint web part. It is part of SharePoint Online. It's part of SharePoint Online if you're not using Classic. All right. You basically can, in Power BI, you can get a link to the report, and then you paste that report into the Power BI web part, and you are off to the races. It uses client-side rendering, which means you need a license, but it only works online, and it only works for modern pages. If you have a classic page in either SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises, you can use Secure Embed. It's another way to share a report in Power BI. It's not as single sign-on focused, but if you're signed into Power BI, you won't get prompted a ton for authentication. It works really well, and you can work it with, you can use it not just with classic SharePoint pages, but you can use it with like WordPress or things of that nature. Do not use anonymous publishing or publish to the web to embed in SharePoint. You will find guidance out there that says do that. You do that, you're putting your organization's data at risk. Anybody can have access to that stuff. All right. In general, you can take not just Power BI content, but you can take other BI content or other non-BI content and just put it on SharePoint pages. And that's how you build out SharePoint dashboards. That was SharePoint's role traditionally in the BI space. You can still use Excel services web parts if you're using Excel visuals. You can still use SSRS if you're on premises. That's just fine. And if you're using SSRS on-prem and you want to embed in the cloud, you can do that too. There are techniques for doing all of those things. Again, it's an eye chart, so I'm not gonna run through it, but suffice it to say, if you've got content on the left and you'd like to embed it in a SharePoint page of the nature of the top, this will tell you the probably your best way of going about it. And again, I've got a blog post on all of this stuff as well. But with that, I'm just going to wrap up here very, very quickly. You can see that SharePoint in the Power BI space serves multiple roles. If you're working with SharePoint data, it can be tricky, but Power Query is your friend, and field values as text is your friend. So 2 things to remember from today, right? The SharePoint folder connector and field values as text, depending on what you're doing. And SharePoint, I didn't get as much time as I'd like to have spent on it, but SharePoint still remains a powerful report delivery platform. And with that, I would love to take any questions. Hopefully we've had some questions pile up, but feel free to reach out to me at these addresses, and let's ask about, let's see if there's any questions.
Okay, we have 3.
Oh, excellent.
3 in
okay.
for you, yeah.
Yeah.
So someone asked, what is the subscription model for Power BI?
I'll assume that means the licensing model. So with Power BI, first of all, if you want to share anything, Power BI is free unless you want to share. And of course, we're talking about SharePoint here, so you're sharing. So you're going to either need to have a SharePoint Pro, or sorry, a SharePoint Pro, a Power BI Pro license. So if you to publish a report, you'll need a Pro license, but to consume it, you also will need a Pro license, unless your organization has purchased premium capacity. And when you buy premium capacity, you publish a report to that capacity, and then anybody can access it without a specific license. So there's 2 modes. Yeah, that's really the answer to that question. I will point out, if you're using E5, if you're using Microsoft 365 E5, you have a Pro license already. So that's the licensing model. And yes, to share that web part with SharePoint, the consumers have to have that license.
Perfect. Okay, next one. Can you work with SharePoint communication sites just as well as with SharePoint team sites?
Can you work with SharePoint communication sites just as well as team sites? Absolutely. If the communication site has list data in it, you can load from it. If the communication site has a document library in it, it can store files that you can load data from. And the communication site is particularly well suited as a platform. That's a good place to put your web parts, things of that nature. So absolutely.
And this person asked about one of the demos, and they said, how can you make sure that every new file will be taken into the report in BI?
How do you make sure that every new file is taken into the report in BI? If you created that report the first way I showed you, by using the service, it won't. It just won't, because you're pointing at a specific file, and your question was about new files. So, but in the case of my thermostat, what happens is I drop one of those files manually, because that's how I get it from my provider. But I drop that in that folder every month. I drop a new file, bang, bang, bang. That Power Query, by hitting the combine button, it iterates through all of the files that I had from the previous step. So you saw me filter down. Down to the folder I needed, and then I filtered out the files I didn't want. The remaining files, when I hit combine, it will iterate through all of them. So as long as the file that lands in that container matches the criteria for inclusion in that previous selection, it will be included. So in my case, as long as I put it in the ecobee folder, and as long as it has the extension CSV, it's included.
Perfect. That's all the questions that are in. A lot of people are saying thanks. One person said as well that was an amazing presentation. So,
thank you.
So on behalf of the community, thank you, John, for joining us today and taking the time to complete the webinar. We appreciate all your effort and time.
It was my pleasure, and I'll look forward to seeing you again. And I think it's June, right? Yeah, yeah. June 1st and 2nd. There you have it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that wraps us up then for today. Make sure you check out our Unreal program that we just announced last week. and the webinar recording will be available later, and you'll be notified by email when it's available, and it'll also be uploaded to the Resource Centre. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and take care and goodbye.